Morning everybody, welcome to Delivering Net Zero for the public sector and commercial buildings. My name is Colin Sowerbutts, I'm the Company Director of Perlustro Limited. We are commercial assessors, commercial retrofit coordinators. Keep going anyway. It's not about us, it's about, we've got a couple of speakers here today. We're going to do a couple of presentations for you on some really decent commercial retrofits that have taken place. And then at the end, you'll have an opportunity to ask some questions, if that's okay. First up, we've got David Bownass, who's the Director of JLL Sustainable Asset Consulting. Thanks, David.
Good morning. We'll move swiftly on. I tend to find that when we have a conversation on net zero carbon, we often all have different thoughts on what it is. So I thought we'd start off with something really simple, and then we can warm up as we go along. So the little slide here is just trying to give you an indication of how net zero carbon works in buildings. So you need to reduce your energy use intensity to a set minimum. In the process of retrofitting your building, if it's a retrofit, you need to calculate your embodied carbon. And then on completion, your embodied carbon should be offset with carbon credits, and your building supplied with renewable energy to deal with operational energy. Hopefully that's something we're all familiar with, but there are different mechanisms. This is broadly UKGBC LETI approach. CREM is somewhat different. CREM tends to look primarily at energy use intensity and carbon emissions. So different standards, different methodologies, but the principles here are correct. Focusing on EUI, because that is really where all the money is in terms of your retrofit product. I think it's just worth touching on where the numbers come from, and we'll come on to the numbers on the next slide. But if you are an insomniac and you'd like to read all the detailed in the LETI document, you'll find at the back of it, it gives some explanation as to where the EUIs have come from. And it's been developed from a bottom up, what's the best you can possibly do, and a top down, what is the projected renewable energy generation the UK has in 2050. Clearly, the top down numbers change over time, and we did some work recently. It was a little online article I've covered right at the end that demonstrates that currently, and I hope this is picked up by the net zero building standard, the EUIs that are set are very much geared around a bottom-up approach, and there's quite a lot of headroom to raise those in our opinion, and hence make your retrofit somewhat cheaper than it would be otherwise. But looking at current numbers, I'm hoping some people are fairly familiar with this. It's well thumbed in our document, and often seen. I suspect it's on lots of presentations today. If we look at the whole building, sorry, I realise as I turn around, the microphone drops out. If we look at the whole building targets, you'll see for Paris-proof net zero carbon for a commercial office, it's 55 kilowatt hours per metre squared per annum. That is actually a very difficult target to hit, and is Neighbours 6-star. If you look in the current market, in the current new build market, they'll be focusing on Neighbours 5, Neighbours 5.5 as best. Now, to achieve those ratings, by the way, forgive me, this UKGBC numbers are for new build. There are no numbers other than some CREM numbers for existing buildings. Achieving 6-star is difficult enough in a new build. Trying to achieve that in an existing building will be even more difficult. And I would suggest that, and I hope we'll see this in the net zero carbon building standard, different EUI targets for existing buildings compared to new. Great, okay. Next slide, into a bit more detail. I think the key reason I put this slide up, and I nearly put financial instead of economic, is that given the EUI targets that we showed before, the temptation for the engineers in the room is to run away and work out what all the engineering things are. I can say this because I come from an engineering background, and you think, okay, well, we can do this and we can do that, and you develop this rather complicated engineering solution, but it doesn't stand alone. It has to sit within a financial economic framework that's viable. And I think we'll see in the next slides, that all the easy win, BMS improvements, LED lighting, that's promoted on a payback is very viable. But if you want to go all the way to net zero carbon, with the current thinking around the business case, then you'll find it's very, very difficult to justify. And that is in part because people's mindset is looking at, in a retrofit environment, is generally looking at a payback. And if you're going to do the deep investment that's needed to transition from fossil fuels and invest in heat pumps and the like, we really need to think about having a slightly different mindset that takes into account some of the externalities, such as shadow cost of carbon, such as the cost of air quality improvement that we're going to get. So there is a big gap in the market, I think, at the moment, in that the framing of the business case to justify the engineering and the transition to net zero carbon isn't really there or well understood, and people are looking at it, shall we say, a very traditional mindset. Having said that, let's have a look at a few examples. Okay, this is an office building, and the red column in this case is actual recorded energy for this office. And you'll see the first reduction, the big large reduction, is around energy optimization. When you model a building and you compare it to the actual energy consumption of the building, there is invariably a big difference, and that difference is the little orange column, and that's because modeling assumes everything is perfect, and in reality the actual operation of the building is not perfect, but it does give you lots of opportunities to make some very easy wins. In fact, I would say most of that orange column probably costs nothing. And then we'll start to, if we then move forward, you see there is a logic behind the sequence. So we've got lighting upgrades, set point upgrades, relatively cheap to do. Then you start to get into the slightly bigger interventions. This is where you start to move away from a simple payback. In this particular case, air handling units, heating system upgrades. The thing that's hidden on this slide is, I'll move away from the microphone. Perhaps the most important thing I would say on this slide is this and this. The glazing upgrade gives you about 5 kilowatt hours in this case per meter squared benefit. The PV gives you about 11. This is cost 4 times more than this. As soon as you start to go into fabric upgrades, you are spending an awful lot of money and not getting much benefit from them. I'll go back. So, in this case, it was this example, similar office set, slightly different. This is actually estimated current performance. So in other words, it's basically a model performance is the red bar. But you can still see there's some energy optimization items. Same broad sequence, and something that I didn't pick up, forgive me, on the previous slide. So we'll go back to this. Even with all these works, and you'll notice by now we've stopped doing fabric upgrades because they just aren't viable in most cases. Even in this case, you're still a mile away from the 55 kilowatt hours, and you're just about touching 70, which is the UK GBC target for post 2030. There's another subtlety which I do need to pick up on as well. In that, the slides that I'm showing you are probably from 12 months ago, and we're coming on to an industrial unit in the moment. If you read LETI guidance, then PV is generation technology, and on the very first slide, what we're looking at is energy use intensity. Okay? Energy use intensity does not include PV. That's a generational technology. So if you look at LETI will say you shouldn't count PV. If you go and look currently at UK GBC, it's a bit of a mixed bag. If you look at their office performance documentation, it'll hint that you can use PV. If you look at their framework, it says that you can't. CREM said that you could, because CREM actually had a slightly different metric. It wasn't EUI, it was net energy demand. Now we roll forwards. CREM's got a new version, came out this year, and they're quite clear. They're now looking at EUI, and you can't take PV into account in your EUI calculation. And I am assured that UKGBC will also take PV out of, or clarify their thoughts on PV and take it out of EUI. So while you can see that PV has a very good, can make a very good contribution, it's relatively cost effective compared to fabric upgrades. In the strictest sense, it shouldn't contribute to your EUI. That doesn't mean it's a bad thing to do, it just won't contribute to your EUI. Next example, this is actually a light industrial unit with a large volume of unheated warehouse and a small office. And you will see there is a very large contribution from PV, because you'll find the trend with industrial warehouses is to cover the roof with PV and strive not just for net zero carbon, but generally for net zero energy. So they're trying to generate more than they consume. And in an unheated warehouse, that's relatively straightforward to do. But again, interestingly, I'll go to the mic, okay. Interestingly, if you look at the sum of all of the facade upgrades, it comes to about 5 kilowatt hours. If you look at the PV, it's about 60. The sum of the PV cost, the cost for the PV is twice the cost. Sorry, the cost for the fabric requirements is twice the cost of the PV. The PV giving you 60 and the fabric giving you 5. So accepting for a moment that PV doesn't contribute to EUI, you can still see there's a significant benefit from it. But those costs that we've spoken about, it's the same with all of the other components back further up the waterfall diagram. So you start to look at fabric upgrades. Fabric upgrades are only really viable when the fabric is at the end of its working life and you're looking to make a big change, or you're trying to change the style of the building, or what other aspects that you might involve fabric. But you won't be doing that on a energy efficiency saving basis. Okay, same building. Here, now forgive me, this is the previous version of CREM. This is not the current version of CREM. So what you're seeing in the red is the, I'll say EUI, it's actually net energy demand profile to net zero. And the green is the carbon emissions. And you'll see that those intervention number 4, all the fabric upgrades are out in about 2042. And that's because that's when the fabric's thrashed and it needs to be replaced. We can also see there's some fairly easy early wins around lighting and heating system upgrades. Okay, I'm conscious of time, so we're getting towards the end. So we can see there's some very significant easy wins in the region of 10, 20, maybe even 25% energy savings. That is where the retrofit market seems to be concentrating at the moment. We do a lot of audits, we're dealing with a lot of clients, and their interest is very much on the easy wins plus PV. There's not that many going the next step. I think they're really waiting to look at the project life cycle and when the MEP plant is thrashed and when the fabric's thrashed. Interesting, that's the second point. Right, okay, so that was plant replacement life cycle for 20 years. We haven't really touched on tenant loads. It's not a problem in light industrial sheds, but if you're looking at offices, then it is a very big problem. And picking up on the last point, in the third point, I would suggest that you look at the retrofit energy saving from the inside out. The complete opposite of those of us who've been doing SAP calcs, where you start on fabric first on the outside and work in. The single biggest contributor you tend to find is the tenant. And if you've got a tenant, for instance, that's mining cryptocurrency, you are not going to get your building to a net zero carbon standard as a whole life energy target. You might before they move in justify it on modelling and using neighbours, but you won't get there. So you've got to think about process loads, you've got to think about occupancy density, you've got to consider perhaps even shifting away from 2 screens and desk computers to laptop single screens, or better still, to I was going to say mobile phones, but similar things to that, and iPads and the like, because you've got a lot of energy saving from those. And to the horror of most of our clients, you won't be having large kitchens, because it just doesn't work if you're trying to get down to as low as 55. I would say that, as you mentioned before, an EUI, if we can elevate EUIs for existing buildings back up to something like 80 or 90 kilowatt hours a metre squared, which is quite achievable, it's also significantly cheaper than trying to get down to 55. Most retrofits will be phased rather than vacant possession. We tend to think it's going to be great, we'll get vacant possession, we can do what we want, off we go. That's not the way it goes, because most clients will want the revenue coming in, and you tend to find lease events all finish at different times. So that shapes the MEP system solutions that you're going to go back with, and it also really prevents you from looking at fabric. I think we've said the last point a few times now, but if there's one thing we take away, it is fabric last. And don't be convinced it's any other way. Having sat in a number of workshops with colleagues from around the industry, there will always be somebody who says fabric first. That is not the right approach to look at economic retrofit. Last slide. There is constant change. As we've mentioned already, we've got the net zero carbon building standard coming out later this year. CREM has changed once. CREM targets will no doubt change again, particularly if we start to build more renewables. Part L 2025 is meant to be net zero carbon, and there was a strong hint from the gentleman who's running the governance process for the net zero carbon building standard that they hope that the net zero carbon building standard will become the government's Part L version in 2025. I would be cautious about that, because part of regulation applies to the whole of England and Wales, and a version of that then goes up to Scotland, of course. When you look at where people are building net zero carbon buildings, they are not evenly scattered around the UK. You'll find they're in London, they're in Manchester, they're in Glasgow, they're in Edinburgh. They're where there is enough value for them to be promoted. That is not the whole of the UK. So it's quite hard for Part L regulations to impose, I would say it's quite hard for them to impose the level of improvements that's going to be needed for net zero carbon. Existing buildings, not new build. I don't consider new build to be a particular topic for us, because the vast majority of the effort needs to be in existing buildings. And existing buildings, so I'm told, are being retrofitted at about 1% a year of our existing stock, and we need to hit 3%. And I would go further and say, I'll be happily to be corrected. If somebody can turn around and show me a retrofitted net zero carbon building that's occurred in the last 2 years and contributed to that 1%, I'll be impressed. But there are millions of buildings, and even if we can find 2 that have been retrofitted to net zero carbon, it's off the scale in terms of what we need to be doing. And final point, little image there, existing buildings, new operational energy targets is available on the JLL website, and it suggests, if my memory serves me right, it's a while ago since we drafted it, that EUIs for existing buildings should really be in the 80 to 100 kilowatt hours a metre squared to give us a fighting chance to achieve that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Put an engineer at the lectern and all the numbers go over everybody's head. What we're going to see now is all of that put into practice through City of Doncaster Council, and we'll bring up Andy and Richard, and they'll show what all of that actually looks like in practice. Okay, thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Andy Maddox. I'm not an energy retrofit expert whatsoever. My role within local authorities, I'm the strategic lead for physical activity and sport within City of Doncaster Council, so I manage anything to do with that, look at the strategies, and I have a client responsibility for our leisure trust and our facilities. Richard, who's joined me today, is Head of Sustainability. So Richard is my technical guru. I'm the person who's going to talk about the lived experience and how we've refurbished and retrofitted one of our leisure centres in Doncaster, which is Askham. So Asken Leisure Centre, and a bit of context about Doncaster. Asken Leisure Centre sits the northwest of the borough. It's in an old mining town. Doncaster is a borough of 100 square miles. It's the largest metropolitan borough in the UK. To drive from one side to the other on the motorway at the very best takes you 45 minutes. Across the city will take you an hour and a half. So it's a borough of communities. We have 11 facilities in the trust, leisure centres, theatres, a brewery, and parts of a country park that we manage within the trust. So a real diverse mix, and we're looking at refurbing these buildings across the borough. At the moment we're in a 12-year refurbishment programme, which stands at the moment of £40 million we're going to spend in the end of those 12 years. That increases every 6 months with inflation, as this build has proven us. First cost were in about £4.5 million for the build. We're just finishing this weekend with tarmacking. It'll be about 5.8 million by the time we've finished. But we need to do the job rightly, and actually new technologies have come on as we've done that. It was built in the early 1970s. It's along the lines of those Paulson builds of that period, if any of your architects know about that. So to give you an indication, just to take the asbestos out of the building in the refit was £130,000. We have another building we're going to retrofit. We can't do that because actually the asbestos to take out is £750,000, so it's cheaper to knock down and rebuild than retrofit. It was, we believe, the last coal-fired leisure centre in England, if not the UK. So up until 2019, when we closed at the pandemic, it was run on coal-fired boilers. It was a typical 70s, 60s build, pool, female changing, male changing, reception area, and a room that had been repurposed to a gym, which was actually not fit for purpose. And it needed a significant subsidy to run. It operated, because of the quality of the building, on a very low level, i.e. swimming for the public was 1 hour a day per week, with clubs and class use, the majority of that. The gym was used by circa 50 people over the week who had membership, so very little use. The question was posed, why don't we knock these facilities down and build something new? To be honest, because of the breadth of our communities, our mayor and our politicians are committed to keeping these facilities in the heart of communities. And at the start of the process, that was a real difficult question and a real difficult process. As we've come out of this, I have the ability to work with Sport England. We're one of 12 national pilots, and the learning we take from this and what we call the whole systems approach around physical activity and well-being is changing the dynamics. So Sport England now are talking more about refurbishing, which wasn't really in their language, to actually new builds. I'm not saying they're going into it in depth, but they are using our case study that we're going to put online soon as an example of actually refurbing a facility can actually have a better, more dramatic effect than a new build on the scale that we are. So this gives you a bit of an indication of the building, and this was about a week after we closed. So we closed for the pandemic, and we had to drain the pool and put the fencing around it. So this is not months and months and months of closure. The building looked like this a month beforehand when it was in operation. Not fit for purpose, not what the community should have, and actually drived our agendas away. Why would you go and take part in swimming in here unless you had no other option? So that's why our refurbishment programme through our facilities is going over 12 years. We've got to go through them all, because none of them been touched for 15 years, except for one new build 12 years ago. So in a really poor condition. The narrative is Doncaster has very poor health indices. So our whole systems approach does not just look at this building. This building sits in a country park, but they didn't speak to each other. We had a car park for the country park, and we had the leisure centre. So you either went and walked in the country park, you went and walked in the leisure centre. You went and played in the leisure centre. You did not do both because they weren't connected. What we have done is the car parks were less than 200 metres apart. We have closed the car parks at the leisure centre now. We opened 2 weeks ago. We actually go in via the countryside car park. So our philosophy is you move to an active environment. You don't go to a leisure centre. It's not a leisure centre, and I'll speak about that after Richard spoke. It's a well-being site, and some of the models that we're putting into there and we're testing in partnership with other areas of the country. Our objectives at the start of this were achieve carbon neutrality as best as possible. It is an old building. Trying to do that is very difficult, as you can imagine, and as we've just had a discussion about. Reduce the cost of service through improved facilities. Richard will touch on the cost of service. The cost of energy on there obviously is more for us now. It would have been with coal, but it's more through the systems. However, we opened 2 weeks ago. From that 1 hour a week lane swimming, we now are actually got an increase in usage that is greater than 2 of our existing centres that were open pre-pandemic and open straight afterwards and have been refurbished. So the demand is there, and we're only half open. We have yet to set the wellness centre up and do some of the work around that I'll touch on. It's increased physical activity levels. And I can stand here in a different environment like I was yesterday and say sport does not increase physical activity levels intrinsically. What you have to do is talk about wellness, physical activity, get people active through other means to actually then get them into sport. So when we talk about sports centres, it puts off 2/3 of the population. So this is a wellness centre, but it's also sending a message out around our environmental aspirations and what we want to do. So it's an active environment, a green park that we're developing. We want to provide a community hub. It's one of the last assets in that community. It's 2 disparate communities that it sits in the middle of that have lost a number of assets over the years. So essentially we want to do that and integrate those into it. Within the building we've changed some of those assets, and I'll talk about those after Richard, but we've actually completely re-evaluated the building, put other assets in there within the budget profile that actually connect with the community in the park. And the last bit on that was we integrate with the community park. So we spent 5.8 million on the building. I've got another £400,000 going into the park and £1 million of revenue to spend over 15 of our parks to get the community to engage in them. And that's part of a test and learn process we're doing with Sport England. So that learning has actually redesigned some of the infrastructure in the building, but also redesigned the infrastructure in the park and how we use the park to engage with the building. So you can have a destination point that keeps people active for longer than, say, a half hour, 40-minute swim. Okay. I'm going to hand over to Richard now to talk about the technical detail, because that's him, and then I'll come back a bit more about the narrative, etc.
Hi everybody, Richard Smith, I'm the Head of Sustainability at Doncaster Council. Andy brought me into this project at an early stage with a request to move from a coal-fired heating system, as Andy mentioned, potentially the last coal-fired leisure centre in England. The political aspiration was to ensure that the asset remained in the community and of course was better utilised by that community. Of course, when you're thinking about moving from coal to something else, thankfully at the time, rather than the council being constantly driven by financial savings, we were moving more towards our new commitment, existing commitment, but enhanced commitment to the environment and sustainability. And so we weren't going to move from coal boilers to gas, thankfully. The timing of the upgrade and the discussion around the design and financing of the retrofit aligned nicely with the public sector decarbonisation of phase 1. That was a government grant made available to the public sector to help with retrofitting, mostly focused on the decarbonisation of heat. And so we applied for public sector decarbonisation scheme. We were successful, albeit the first time round, Salix deemed that the application probably wasn't, it was very much at the back end of the application process. Less funding was made available. They were probably looking at the centre and thinking, is this really going to be a worthwhile investment? But what really intrigued Salix clearly was the fact that this was the last coal-fired leisure centre in England. And so we moved on to the procurement. We had to undertake this in a very quick period of time. Anybody working with local authority or who's worked for a local authority may appreciate there's a lot of red tape. So procurement and then moving on to a design and build wouldn't necessarily work within 6 months, which was the requirement of the public sector decarbonisation scheme. Thankfully, there was an appreciation of a bit of realism, and of course at the time when we were coming out of Brexit and COVID, that there was acceptance that we could have an extension, thankfully, albeit we were one of very few projects that were actually running to schedule, but certainly not to a 6-month design, build and procurement. We procured the services of Equans and their supply chain for the design and build. Air source heat pumps were naturally the go-to solution for the centre for the heating and hot water. And while the ongoing requirement for heating and hot water in the centre would be at a lower level, we had to account for, which included in the specification of the heat pumps, along with a new power upgrade, would be for the rare but necessary occasion when you need to drain and refill the pool and therefore reheat the pool. So the forecast operation and use energy consumption for the site it was and is only opened a few weeks ago, so unfortunately I can't tell you what's actually happening, but it was forecast to be 235,000 kilowatt hours per year. The original plan was to insulate the roof space, flat roof space, and the upper cavity walls. I don't know if Andy mentioned in his presentation, but the site is essentially a swimming pool on stilts. The swimming pool is at first floor level. So when we were looking at insulation of the fabric, and I must nod to David's presentation, when you're running the calculations for the fabric, the clear winner is of course the conversion of the heating system combined with renewables. The fabric gives little return, still is necessary, certainly in a leisure centre setting, but gives little return compared to the other interventions that we've applied to the retrofit design. And so when we looked at the condition of the roof space and the walls, we found that it was a very poor condition, and the roof space itself allowed for little thermal performance to be improved, not to the level that we wanted to achieve. So we looked at instead a Bowder flat roof new system, PIR system, 120 mil of polyurethane board that wraps around the roof and the upper floor of the building. So it is described, with you term to me, but a warm roof. We applied double glazing of windows and doors, standard fittings, double glazing and metal frames. LED throughout. We have added to the lighting design. The centre has changed a little bit in terms of its use and slight different layout of certain rooms, so we increased the lighting capacity. Due to the original electric connection only accounting for low use, the lighting and small appliances, the change to high-powered air source heat pumps required an electrical upgrade, 3-phase, 400 volt, which actually then required an on-site substation. Solar was in the original plan. Sadly, we had to rule it out. We had designed in a 50 kilowatt PV array to maximise the roof space based on the design at that time versus the design now in terms of the output of solar PV panels. We probably could have got about 80 to 90 kilowatt of installed capacity on there now. However, due to the weight of the new warm roof, we couldn't install it. As mentioned, because of the raised area of the swimming pool itself, there's a gantry entrance into that first floor level. So we looked at an alternative as a canopy. Anybody who's been involved in canopy design and build and the costings for solar carports and so on, you'll appreciate the installed the price, the pound per kilowatt of installed capacity is 5-6 times what it is if it's just roof or ground based. So solar wasn't included. One thing that's missing from this slide is a recent installation of a 22 kilowatt EV charge point, a twin charge point. So what we were fortunate to access the public sector decarbonisation scheme funding, of course initially being rejected but then being allowed into the scheme. The experience of accessing the funding has been fairly good in terms of the reporting requirement. It's fairly light compared to other government programmes that we've been involved in. I mentioned the original timescales given by Salix were very prohibitive. Thankfully, we got the extension that was required. There were significant delays associated with the supply chain, especially around the substation and the air source heat pumps that were coming from Europe. The original budget, £1.7 million for the decarbonisation part alone, was not met. The change to the specification in the roof insulation and the wall insulation increased significantly. The requirement for the power upgrade on site, and also due to the treatment of the asbestos in the boiler room. Finally from me, with the increase of electricity that we're all experiencing, have been for some time and will continue to, of course the council is in the same position. The original expectation was that the cost would have been slightly more expensive, but similar to what we were experiencing with the price of coal. At that point, we were only paying just higher than 10p per kilowatt hour. Now we're looking at upwards of £90,000 to £100,000 for the operation use for the heating and hot water. While we don't have a direct wire of energy generation coming into this site, and, to deem it net zero in use, there's a lot of development in Doncaster. Up to just last year, we had two small 5 megawatt solar farms, not owned by the council, these are privately owned. More recently, an application's been approved for a 49 megawatt solar farm. There's another one at the planning committee in the next couple of weeks for 49 megawatt with on-site green hydrogen generation, and also started the early stages of planning application for a 600 megawatt solar farm. Depending on if that is approved and if it's built, I'm sure at the moment it would be the largest in Europe. By the time it is built, that would be 2028, 2029, if it's approved through planning, and I'm sure there'll be somebody that trumps that installed capacity by that point. But what this is wanting to lead on to is either whether it's an asset that the council owns or whether it's owned by the private sector. We are engaged in those developments, talking to each of those parties about a power purchase agreement. And while I know this electricity goes into the grid, I suppose, and we can't claim that the site or our other sites would be net zero in use, the need and want and desire to have a 100% renewable energy tariff supply that's coming into the council that is generated in Doncaster would be an ambition that we look to realise within the next 12 to 18 months.
Okay, so Richard just told you sort of the technical work on that. Really what my job is to do is to knit this into the fabric of Doncaster, not just from a leisure perspective, but from a whole systems approach. We talk a lot about whole systems and how things are connected and how they influence. Essentially, to build a new one of these centres, we've got a cost of one we're looking at the moment, which is about 11 to 14 million. So we've actually got quite a good return for our money when we talk around close to 6 million spend, of which Salix was 1.7 and Sport England 910,000 into that, particularly when we connect the park and bring all those other assets into play. But it has allowed us to completely refurbish the facilities. Sport England don't generally invest into refurbishment of facilities, but they were on site 3 weeks ago, and their comments was this is just like a new build, and the learning that we've taken from this will be distilled through Sport England and how they align their capital funds going forward. Because the key thing for us is that we do not take assets out of our communities unless we are really forced to. Because our communities, if you talk about levelling up, have lost out on numerous assets over the years, and in taking more out of there, they don't get replaced. So that's why this is left in there. The air source heat pumps have really changed the building. You go in it now, even the weather we've got at the moment, we can keep it warm with the insulation, etc. And it's just an environment people want to go in. Even over the 3 weeks we've been operating, our usage figures are the highest they've been across 4 of the centres so far. The new village change has allowed us to free up space and work in a way that wasn't possible before. And we've got a well-being space. So when I take about a whole system, I sit in the public health team. In Askham, we have issues around COPD, ageing population, a lot around skeletal, etc., and mental health. So to put a gym in there would not be the right thing to do. That was what most leisure trusts would do, would put a gym straight in there because it actually generates money. What we are looking at is systems of well-being. So we're having discussions around using the facility for cancer prehab and post-hab. The reason behind that is we do not have that in South Yorkshire at the moment. We're looking on a South Yorkshire basis and having hubs. If we have somebody exercising for two months prior to they have their cancer either intervention, that average stops 4 days in a hospital. That's £6,000 a day of saving. So for a few £100 to bring that person into the centre, have specialist use because we've designed the centre to be the most accessible. Within the centre, we've got changing places so non-ambient people who don't move can use it. We have a lift into the pool, which wasn't there before. We have changing rooms specifically designed, and you can access from those changing rooms into the pool. So this money's given us a whole chance to reinvent this leisure provision. And that's what I would urge you. If you are looking at refurbing these buildings, particularly in this remit, and also making them as environmentally friendly, as carbon neutral as possible, don't forget what you can do to influence the wider system in your locality and help your populations. Use that as an opportunity. I mentioned we're linking in with the park. So the park had no facilities before. So our reception area now is a concierge. We don't have a receptionist. You walk in, the staff walk around with iPads, there's no receptionist. If you book online, you can go in and sign yourself in and go to your class or use the pool. If you can't do that, you can get one of the members of staff to do it on the iPad. And at the very least, we have like Costa coffee pod units in there that sell drinks, etc. But you can still do your payments there with that as well. A park cafe, which wasn't in the thinking beforehand, we've put in. So we mentioned the building's on stilts. What we've done with the lower floor now is turn that into a cafeteria area that the park users can do with all their own facilities, so we can keep clean area in the leisure centre, dirty area below, so we eat clean on the cleaning. And we've extended the provision. It will now be open 7 days a week from 6:30 in the morning till 10 o'clock at the night. We were open 5 days a week, 1 day closed on a Sunday, 1 day in the weekend except for clubs, and only open when there was pre-bookings except for that hour. So we've changed the model of this. We're also changing the thinking. Our next step now is, because this building sat in a community that was built on coal, that's gone. This building was run on coal, that's gone. It's now a new environment. We're actually going to start working through the Leisure Trust with the community and all the schools and the Carbon Literacy Trust to actually use this as an anchor around education around carbon literacy. We've left the old boilers in the building, partly because it was so costly to take them out because of the asbestos, £200,000, but we're going to glaze the front so people can actually see, young people can see what coal boilers look like when there's none of those left. And we can have that discussion with them while they're coming on site, either to use the green space, the blue space in the pool, go to the gym, wellness or whatever, or reminisce with older people. So use the tools that you have on a wider agenda is my ask of you if you do this, and that's what we've achieved there. If any of you want to come and have a look at it, more than happy to show you around. If you want the case study, it goes on our website in a couple of weeks, and that's Get Doncaster Moving, and that'll be on the front page. But if you need to talk about it, want to come and see it, have that lived experience from a non-person who, it's such a steep learning curve for me. This, before this, I just thought about LED lighting and maybe air source heat pumps at home. I've had to deal with this over the past 2 years through a pandemic. So it's a steep learning curve, and I can take you on that journey if you want and tell you the pitfalls that we've had, but the good experiences as well. Thank you. And some images of the centre, as we go in. So those original ones, air source heat pumps inside in the building, and a picture of the new pool hall. That's completely refurbished. The rest of the building is up to that specification, and the outside as well is. Thank you.
I think we can all agree it's a major transformation of that leisure centre. We've probably just got a few minutes left if anybody's got questions for the guys, and we will be hanging about just after the presentations finish. If anybody wants to grab any one of us, then if anybody's got a question, there's got a question over there. Somebody will bring the mic over to you.
Thank you, that was really fascinating. Do you have any tips on how to make best use of the air source heat pump with things like sealing the building as much as possible?
Is this one? It's working? Yeah, it's working. Okay. I think it's reasonably well known that if you want to get if you're going to be heating spaces at 45 degrees C, you're going to have to get your infiltration rate down in your building quite significantly to be able to keep that heat in. So I think it's I don't know what you actually ended up doing, but certainly on other buildings, newer builds, you'd be talking about 3 or 4 in terms of your air leakage numbers to be able to get your heat pumps to work. Because also there's also issues about capacity as well, but I see in this particular case splitting the two was very useful into high temperature hot water and to low temperature hot water. But it's really about trying to make your envelope as efficient as it can be to reduce the load. Yeah. I think you probably knew that though.
Okay. Does that answer your question? Okay, thank you. Any other questions? We've got another question here. I'll come over to you.
Hello? It's working. Hi, thanks. Just a question. given the nature of the commercial building, a swimming pool, presumably a lot of shower use and certain sort of cyclical use, was wastewater heat recovery thought about in the specification, or might it be thought about if it wasn't to be retrofitted? I just think there's a great opportunity in these types of buildings to use the wastewater heat to preheat the air source heat pump and make further savings.
Sadly, quick answer is I'm afraid not, but certainly in terms of next phases, I suppose with this one, it was the first leisure centre we did to this level of specification. In hindsight, there's a number of things that you've missed. Probably a fairly obvious one in terms of the actual operational use associated with this. So one missed on our part, but certainly a learning curve for us for next time.
Yeah, and on top of that, technology will move on as well, and wastewater heat recovery has moved on quite a lot in the last few years. So I'm sure forward, the wastewater heat recovery would be a model that's used. Thank you for your question.
Hi. Based on David's presentation, I'd like to just understand, given the targets now for moving with EPCs to C and B, etc., are we going to find ourselves in a situation where in areas where you've got high value, you can see alternative uses coming forward, but what about areas of low value? Are we going to end up when you won't be able to retrofit and it's not necessarily viable to redevelop?
There is some evidence that the market's splitting into two. If you like, you've got a Premier League market and you've got another league market. We won't put a number on that. And I think I was at a gathering recently with some investor clients. I think there's a lot of investor clients in a strange way hoping for the costs of assets, shall we say, outside the Premier League to go down significantly so that they can justify the spend to bring them up. So I think we'll find that there'll be a market where certain clients only invest in Premier Leagues. Other people, until it's regulated, carry on with buildings as normal, and there'll be a niche that starts to develop for people to buy buildings that are suboptimal and then upgrade them to optimal. And we're certainly aware of, well, I'm aware of 2 or 3 different funds that are starting to look at that. But at the moment, I would say they're all looking at it in the London, Manchester, Edinburgh, Glasgow, main areas where they know there's a premium for those. I think the difficulty is going to come is when the government, hopefully it does, get to a point where it decides to regulate the next part of Part L and spread that broadly across the UK. I don't think it'd be a problem for new build particularly. I only wish we'd carried on with the Code for Sustainable Homes back from 2008, because we'd be in a much better place today. But for all those, 25 million existing homes, there's a huge amount of work to be done, and I don't see how they can retrospectively regulate for that. And that also occurs for other buildings as well. So there will be a market, absolutely be a market, but I think it'll be very much for investors to pick that up and convert that rather than through a regulatory framework.
Thank you, David. Sorry, we've probably just got time. I'm just conscious of time. I know that we've got a question coming in from the back there.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Sinead. What grants, funding routes, finance would you recommend other councils should look at? What worked for you?
Good question. For me, the starting point is the political will to do this. If there's a political will, then generally the money can be found in most cases. Our starting point on this process was a budget of £500,000. And then the opportunity to bid for the Salix funding sort of opened up a completely different viewpoint. So within that, we then committed to covering the remaining monies. And that, to be honest, was a little bit open-ended because we were designing it as we go. I know earlier we said about, the economic approaches to design a building from day one. We had to design this as we went through because we were finding things. So there are those Salix streams still coming down, I believe, There also is Sport England support there, but generally the core of it is capital resource from a local authority, and that's why you have to make the case this is not just about a leisure centre, if it's a leisure centre refurbing, or a museum, or an arts heritage building. From my viewpoint, this is about what is the intrinsic value of this for the well-being and the place, and not to lose that, and that was really the starting point around those conversations.
Okay. I'm getting conscious of time. We are going to hang about as soon as this is now finished. But if I cut it there for everybody, thank you very much for your attendance. Thank you very much for your questions. If you've got any further questions, then just come and speak to one of us. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the conference.